Hey, this is Bunny. Today we're doing something a little different. I'm going to be painting this sci-fi bounty hunter while we talk about something that's been on my mind for a little while now. Villains. Not just how they look, but how we create them, how we remember them, and why they stick with us so much longer than we sometimes expect. Because if you've been around tabletop games, RPGs, or really any kind of storytelling for a while, you start to notice something. The heroes change. Campaigns come and go. Characters get swapped out. But villains? Villains have a way of lingering. And I think part of that comes down to how we experience them. Heroes are often seen from the inside. We play them. We think like them. We make decisions as them. But villains? We experience them from the outside. We don't always know what they're thinking. We don't always understand their full plan. There's distance there. And that distance creates mystery. And mystery is powerful. Because the less you fully understand something, the more your mind fills in the gaps. You start wondering what they're going to do next. You start anticipating their moves. You start building them up in your own head. And sometimes, the version of the villain in your imagination becomes even more impactful than what's actually happening at the table. That's something really unique to villains in storytelling. They're not just characters, they're questions. I can't tell you how many times I've forgotten a party composition or the exact plot of a campaign, but I can still clearly remember that one villain. That one that made everything harder. The one that got away. The one that showed up when we least expected it and completely changed the direction of the story. And I think part of that is because villains aren't just obstacles. They're anchors. They give the story weight. Without them, everything feels a little bit directionless. As I'm working on this miniature, blocking in some of the darker tones, I'm already thinking about what kind of villain this character might be. Not in terms of stats or mechanics, but in terms of presence. What kind of energy do they bring into a room? Are they loud and intimidating? Do they announce themselves? Or are they quiet? The kind of villain you don't notice until it's already too late. Those are the kinds of questions that, for me, make villains interesting. Because a good villain isn't just defined by what they do. They're defined by how they make everyone else feel. Think about the villains you remember most from your own games. It's probably not just what they did that stuck with you. It's how they made your characters react. The tension they created. The uncertainty. Maybe it was a villain who always seemed just one step ahead. Or one who wasn't physically powerful, but was impossible to pin down. Or maybe it was someone who didn't even see themselves as the villain at all. That's where things start to get really interesting. Because the best villains, the ones that really stick, aren't just evil for the sake of being evil. They have reasons. Not always good reasons, not always justifiable ones, but reasons that make sense to them. And when you start thinking about villains that way, they stop being flat characters. They start becoming people. Complicated, messy, sometimes even relatable people. And that's where things can get uncomfortable in the best possible way. Because once you understand a villain, once you can see how they got from point A to point B, it gets a lot harder to dismiss them as just the bad guy. Now that doesn't mean you have to agree with them, not even a little bit, but it adds layers, it adds tension, it makes every interaction feel like it matters. As I'm painting this bounty hunter, I'm not trying to make them look flashy or heroic. I'm leaning into that idea of someone who exists in the gray areas, someone who probably doesn't think of themselves as a villain at all. And honestly, that's one of my favorite types. The kind of character who sees themselves as practical, necessary, maybe even justified. They're not out to destroy the world. They're just doing what needs to be done, at least from their perspective. Those are the villains that make players hesitate. The ones that make you stop and think, wait, are we sure we're on the right side of this? And those moments, those are gold in tabletop storytelling. There's also something really special about the moment when a villain shifts from being just another enemy into the villain. It's not always a big dramatic reveal. Sometimes it's subtle. A pattern starts to emerge, a name keeps coming up, a symbol appears more than once. And slowly, the players start to realize that these things are connected. That realization, that moment when everything clicks, is incredibly powerful. Because suddenly the story feels bigger, more intentional, like there's something behind the curtain pulling at the strings. And once that feeling is there, it changes how players approach everything. They start paying more attention. They start asking more questions. They start thinking ahead. And that's when a game really comes alive. Because suddenly it's not just about winning the fight. It's about making a choice. And choices are what people remember. I think that's why villains tend to stick with us longer than heroes. Heroes are often defined by what they stand for. Villains are defined by what they're willing to do. And that difference creates tension. Now, from a creative standpoint, whether you're a dungeon master, a player, or even just someone painting miniatures, that tension is something you can lean into. You don't need a complicated backstory. You don't need pages of lore. Sometimes all it takes is one clear motivation and the willingness to follow it through all the way. As I'm adding some wear to this armor, thinking about where the paint would chip and where the metal would show through, I like to imagine what kind of situations would cause that kind of damage. Not in a technical sense, but in a narrative one. Was this a fight they barely survived? Was it from years of smaller, less dramatic jobs? Is this someone who takes risks or someone who avoids them? Those little details don't just make the miniature look better, they make the character feel more real. And once a character feels real, everything else falls into place. One thing I've noticed over the years is that the villains people remember the most aren't always the strongest ones. They're the ones who show up consistently. There's something almost psychological about it too. The more often a villain appears, the more familiar they become, and familiarity builds investment. Even if the players don't like them, even if they actively hate them, the emotional reaction is exactly what you want. Because indifference is the real enemy of storytelling. If players don't care about a villain, then nothing they do really matters. But if players are reacting, if they're frustrated or curious or even a little bit impressed, then you've already succeeded. And interestingly, villains who survive encounters tend to become more memorable than ones who are defeated immediately. Not because they're stronger, but because they linger. They come back. They adapt. They become part of the ongoing narrative instead of a single moment. They don't just appear once for a big dramatic fight, but they weave themselves into the story over time. They adapt. They learn. Because nothing raises the stakes like a villain who grows alongside the players. A villain who changes tactics, who responds to what the party does, who doesn't just sit and wait to be defeated. That kind of villain feels alive. And when something feels alive in a game, it becomes personal. Now, I'm not saying every villain needs to be that complex. There's absolutely a place for straightforward, over-the-top antagonists. Sometimes you just want something big and dramatic to fight, and that's perfectly fine. But even then, giving them one or two defining traits can go a long way. Maybe they're reckless or arrogant. Maybe they underestimate the party in a very specific way. Those little touches make them memorable. Another thing that can make a villain stand out is consistency in behavior. Not predictability, but consistency. If a villain always approaches a problem in a certain way, players will start to recognize it. They'll start to anticipate it. And then, when that pattern either holds or breaks, it creates tension. For example, if a villain is always calm and controlled, the moment they lose that control becomes incredibly impactful. Or if they're usually reckless, the moment they act with precision feels deliberate and dangerous. These kinds of patterns don't require complicated writing. They just require awareness. And once you start paying attention to them, they become one of the most effective tools you have. As I start adding highlights here, just bringing out some of the edges so the miniature reads a little better from a distance, I'm thinking about how visual design plays into this too. Even without words, a good design can tell you a lot about a character. Sharp angles versus rounded shapes. Clean lines versus rough textures. Bright colors versus muted ones. All of these choices communicate something. And this is where visual design and storytelling really start to overlap in a meaningful way. When I'm painting something like this bounty hunter, I'm not just thinking about realism. I'm thinking about readability. If someone glanced at this miniature for just a second, what would they assume about this character? Are they dangerous? Careful? Aggressive? Professional? Those impressions happen almost instantly, and they're shaped by the choices you make. Color, contrast, wear, silhouette. It's the same thing in storytelling. Players are constantly forming impressions based on limited information, and a well-crafted villain takes advantage of that. You don't always need a long explanation. Sometimes a single action, a single line of dialogue, or even a single moment is enough to define a villain. Those are the moments players latch onto. The moments when the villain walks away instead of finishing the fight. The moment when they say something that hits a little too close to home. The moment when you realize they've been pulling strings behind the scenes the entire time. Those are the moments that get talked about long after the game is over. And honestly, that's one of my favorite parts of this whole hobby. Not just playing the game, but talking about it afterwards. Remembering the moments that stood out. The decisions that didn't have easy answers. Villains are at the center of so many of those conversations. And sometimes, it's not even the biggest villain in the story that people remember most. Sometimes it's a smaller character. Someone who only showed up a few times but left a really strong impression. Maybe they had a distinct personality. Maybe they had a unique way of speaking. Maybe they just interacted with the party in a way that felt different. Those characters can become just as iconic as the main antagonist. Because memorability isn't always about scale. It's about impact. And impact comes from clarity. Knowing exactly what makes a character stand out and leaning into it. As I'm finishing up some of these details, I always like to take a step back and just look at the miniature as a whole. Not for perfection, but for feeling. Does this look like someone who belongs in a story? Does it feel like a character you'd remember? And that's really what this comes down to. The art of villains isn't about making something dark or edgy just for the sake of it. It's about creating something that resonates. Something that creates tension, emotion, and memory. Something that players will still be talking about months or even years later. Because at the end of the day, the best villains don't just exist in the moment. They leave a mark. And if you can do that, whether through storytelling, gameplay, or even just how you paint a miniature, you're already doing something special. I think that's why I keep coming back to villains, both in games and in painting. They give you room to explore ideas that heroes don't always allow. They let you play with tone, with ambiguity, with tension. They let you ask questions instead of just answering them all the time. And whether you're building a character for a campaign, or writing down a story, or just sitting down to paint a miniature like this, that kind of creative freedom is incredibly valuable because it pushes you to think a little deeper, to look beyond the surface, and to create something that doesn't just exist, but leaves an impression. That's about it for today. Tell me about a villain you'll never forget from your own games in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories. For now, I hope you'll be back with us next time. Bye!